This is part 3 of the Bataan Death March story as told through the drawings of Ben Steele, a Death March survivor. In part 1 and 2, the background of the Death March was presented, detailing the conditions and events preceding the surrender of the American and Philippine troops and the march back up the Bataan Peninsula. The Bataan Death March story has been told in movies, in print, and in harrowing first-person accounts. This video too is a Bataan Death March story, but it's unique in that it tells the story using pictures and drawings made by Ben Steele, a Death March survivor. Water was a scarce commodity in Camp O'Donnell. Men had to line up to receive their meager rations of rice and soup. If they were lucky, there would be a fish head in the soup. Sometimes they were given green fish that was rotten, and once in a while the soup would contain kelp. One dish that the prisoners developed themselves was called kwan. Kwan is a Filipino word that has little meaning and could, therefore, be applied to almost anything. It came to designate any extra food or ration the prisoners could get by fair means or otherwise. The prisoners were issued a small tin bucket that came to be called a kwan bucket. One recipe for kwan was as follows. Obtain from the black market or commissary a small can of fish and some coconut lard. At chow time, try to get a mess kit filled with rice. After lining a kwan bucket with lard, put in the rice along with some red peppers you may have managed to gather while on jungle detail. The kwan bucket would then go into a bed of hot coals and the food in it baked. The prisoners liked it fine and readily ate it. For some at O'Donnell, escape was the answer. However, the Japanese countered this with a condition that for each escapee, 10 prisoners were killed. The prisoners then guarded each other closely. Those thought to have important information were tortured and put in dark underground prisons. Victims lay in their cells, unable to escape the screams of other prisoners, and hoped they would be forgotten about. Old rice sacks were used to carry the few belongings of men about to move camp. Prisoners mended their clothing with pieces of wood, leather, and string. They made kwan cans from pieces of tin and wire. These belongings became priceless. On the 1st of June, the Japanese told the American officers in charge at Camp O'Donnell that 325 men were needed to work on a jungle road project. This project came to be known as the Tayabas Road Detail. Ben Steele was one of the soldiers selected to go. The Tayabas Road Detail was even more difficult than the Death March, especially since none of the soldiers knew when it would be over. For most, it would end in death. Out of the original 325 soldiers, Ben was one of only 50 who survived the work camp. While working on the Tayabas work detail, Ben recalls a Jap beating him with a bolo scabbard. A bolo knife was a machete first used by the Filipino troops against the Japanese, but adopted by them to harass the Americans. In this drawing, Prisoners too weak to make shelters for themselves lie on napa leaves on the wet ground. Rain and typhoons add to the prisoners' misery. At the end of the 2-month Tayabas road detail, only 5 or 6, quote, workers, unquote, can walk. After working on the Tayabas road detail, Ben became so ill from beriberi, dysentery, pneumonia, blood poisoning, and malaria that he could no longer work. He was moved to Bilibid prison for 18 months. During the time at Bilibid, Ben began to record with his drawings the extent of human degradation and cruelty the prisoners were subjected to. He did so at great risk. The consequences of being caught making these drawings could have resulted in severe punishment or death. He provides this record as a tribute to those who did not survive and as an expression of what he experienced. The men in Bilibid prison built a crude chapel against one of the fortress walls for church services. All denominations worshiped there. By this time, prisoners had taken the sleeves and legs off their clothing to patch what was left. They wore the same uniforms for 2.5 years. They made, quote, clackers, unquote, by nailing what remained of their shoes, the boot tops, to pieces of boards. About his drawings, Ben explained, "I used to sit there day after day. I thought I'd lose my damn mind. I wanted something to do, so I started drawing with anything I could find to draw with. I'd draw on walls. People around me said, 'Why don't you draw the guys? You know, there are no photographs taken of this stuff.' So I started drawing stuff around the camp and sketches of people and portraits as close as I could. I wasn't very skillful." Unschooled in drawing, Ben used charcoal from open fires to draw on the backside of Japanese custom papers, producing a series of 70 drawings. Ben's drawings were hidden and kept, but didn't make it home. A Catholic priest to whom he entrusted his drawings went down on a ship in the South China Sea. Ben later produced these drawings from memory. As soon as the war ended, Ben started drawing those scenes of horror again, and he's never stopped. His black and white drawings and full-color oil paintings have been displayed many times. On July the 4th, 1944, Ben was loaded aboard the freighter Canadian Inventor, named Mati Maru by the prisoners. On September the 2nd, 1944, Ben arrived at Moji, Japan. On September the 3rd, 1944, Ben arrived at the Ominemachi coal mine, Japan. 2 drawings that he did while he worked in the coal mine on the Japanese mainland did survive. However, most of the drawings and 3 paintings are now in the collection of Montana State University, the Billings Foundation. After working in a Japanese coal mine less than 80 miles from ground zero of the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, Ben's captivity ended. Work then ceased in the coal mines. American planes dropped food, clothing, medical supplies, and leaflets into his camp. Soon he boarded a train and met the occupation troops at Wakayama, Japan. The war was over for Ben Steele. This is the end of this Bataan Death March story. We, as Americans, should be especially proud that our country has produced such great men as Ben Steele and the other heroes of Bataan.